Hi, today we'll be going through an action movie titled Drive. Dark at night in a poorly lit room, a guy who's named Driver can be seen talking to a client, and he made it clear that he would only be available for the job in 5 minutes, after which he would leave. Then he sets off to carry out the job. He went to his employer, Shannon, who then gave him the most popular car in California, the Chevy Impala. He drove the car to a place and signaled the two masked men, and they went into a building with their guns. The driver then placed a watch in his car and began to count down the time for exactly 5 minutes. Before the time elapsed, the thieves entered the car and swiftly drove off to a football watching center, escaping the sight of the policeman. The same night, in an elevator to his apartment in the complex, he got to meet his beautiful neighbor Irene, and because of the awkward silence, he briefly smiled at her. The next day at work, he put on a mask for the short play in which he dangerously drove the car and got hit by another car, and Shannon praised his skill happily. A few hours later, he went to a shopping complex to get some stuff and happened to meet Irene and her son, Benicio. Not wanting to disturb them, he didn't approach them, but while about to leave, Irene's car had a fault, so he assisted the mother and son, and also helped them to take what they bought to their apartment. He stayed for a while in Irene's apartment and had a brief chat with her, but it is quite obvious that they both were attracted to each other as they continuously gazed at each other before he left for his apartment. Later, Shannon met with a man known as Bernie at a restaurant, and he told him to try out the driver. While discussing Bernie's partner Nino, after so much conviction, Bernie agreed to do business only if he gets to see the driver's skill. So the driver skillfully drove in Bernie's presence to showcase his skill. After the brief display, Bernie shook hands with him and he praised the driver for his skill. Days later, Irene came over with her son Benicio to fix her car, and on seeing her, the driver smiled widely as he continued fixing the car. Minutes later, Shannon told him to drive Irene in her car and he obliged. While driving, he asked the mother and son if they would like to see something, and they agreed. So he took to a beautiful site of flowing water, and they played for a while before deciding to call it a day. Because Benicio was asleep, the driver carried him to the apartment, and before leaving for his apartment, he and Irene stared lovingly at each other. So he asked if she and Benicio would be free for the weekend, and Irene happily replied yes. When it was the weekend, the three played happily together, but Benicio fell asleep after a while, so he took Irene out, and on the way, Irene slowly placed her hands on his and massaged it softly. The next day at work, the driver got to meet Nino and Bernie, asked him about the new task they currently had together, so he replied that he would try his best to get it done smoothly. Like always, when it was night, he played games with Benicio while Irene got dressed for their outing, but while doing this, she got a call that made her sad. The lawyer had called to inform her that her husband, Standard, would be coming home in a few days. On their way to their date, Irene looked gloomily and she broke the news to him that her husband was coming home soon. This caused him to stop the car abruptly, but later kicked off the car and drove off as he maintained a cool nature. When Standard got home, he organized a small party with family and friends, and everyone jubilated his freedom. But Irene wasn't happy because she currently has feelings for another man. So minutes later, she went out of the party, and because of the party noise, the driver wasn't able to stay in the room. So he decided to take in some fresh breeze. But then he met Irene sitting on the floor looking confused. So he briefly smiled at her, but then her husband came out with Benicio and they greeted each other awkwardly before Standard took Benicio out. So the two can chat. Days later, he was about to park his car when he noticed some dangerous guys coming out of the building. So he traced where they had come out from and happened to see a badly wounded Standard and Benicio, who secretly watched all that had happened. He helped them out, and while at the apartment, he asked Standard who the men were, but he at first refused, but later explained that he owed $1,000 while he was at the prison, and now they were disturbing him to carry out an evil deed, but he refused. In the sitting room, the driver saw Benicio fiddling with a substance, so he collected it and saw that they had given the little boy a bullet to hold for next time. So he smiled at the young boy and collected the bullet from him. Later, he had a meal with a family, and Standard introduced the driver as his new friend, and they all chatted happily for a while. Days later, he and Standard then went to meet a man called Cook, and they negotiated the business with him, but in return, the driver told the cook that he wants them to leave Standard alone, and he agreed. So he and Standard with a criminal lady went to a pawn shop. The lady and Standard swiftly entered the pawn shop smartly with glasses on, but during the operation, a car parked close to them, and this got the driver angry. The lady quickly entered the car a few minutes later, and before the 5 minutes elapsed, Standard came out of the shop, but suddenly the pawn owner shot him, and in the blink of an eye he fell dead. So the driver quickly entered the car back and swiftly drove away. When they got to his apartment, the young lady kept looking nervous, so he closed the door and forced her to speak the truth, and she told him about how the cook had told her that there would be the presence of another car to delay them, but she didn't know that they would be killed. This greatly infuriated the driver, and seconds later, the lady excused herself to use the restroom, but suddenly her head got blown off and the driver tried hiding from the men and smartly killed them so he would be finally free. But due to this, he got injured during the fight, so he dragged his injured bodies over to Shannon's workplace and Shannon attended to his injury. At night, he went over to the cook's hideout angrily and attacked him with a hammer by pinning him to the floor, but the man begged to not be killed. So he took the bullet given to Benicio and forced it down the man's throat. After killing the cook, he dialed the boss's number, which happened to be Nino, so he told him to come over to get his money. At night, while at his apartment, he called Irene and told her about his and her husband's little adventure. He as well asked her if she wished to have the money for herself, but she angrily slapped him. Later, they entered an elevator, but the driver noticed something strange with the man in the elevator with him. So slowly, he turned and deeply kissed Irene, and after a while, he stopped. The man was about to attack him when he swiftly attacked the man, and he forcefully used his legs to break off the man's head skull. While Irene watched terrified, and when the elevator opened, she left him alone while feeling so scared. The driver wanted to know why the man came to his apartment, so he angrily went to Shannon's office. Then his boss told him that he had mistakenly spilled that if they leave out Irene, they would be safe. This made him so angry at Shannon as he tightly held onto his collar. Then he told him that he should immediately pack and leave the country because his life was in danger. When Bernie heard what Nino had done, he was so angry but doesn't have a choice but to support him, and he started this by first killing a man in their gang that heard their discussion. Bernie then went over to Shannon's workplace and he met the man when he was about to leave the country. So he greeted Shannon and then told him that it was his bad luck that caused his day. To part ways, he stretched out his hand to shake Shannon, and when Shannon received it, then swiftly he cut a part of the man's flesh and firmly held it for a while. When the driver came around, he saw that Shannon had bled to death, and this greatly made him sad as he tried to fight the tears which were about to roll down his eye. So he went to Nino's place of enjoyment and put on a mask to confirm if he was inside. Then he saw Nino laughing at whatever the ladies might have said. The driver waited outside for Nino, and when the man left with his driver, he trailed after them. At a point, he hit Nino's car, causing it to come to an abrupt stop, and he hid for a while. Nino's driver came out and searched for the person that had stopped them, but didn't find anyone, so he entered the car back. Just then, the driver honed loudly and speedily drove and hit Nino's car from the edge of the cliff he had trapped them to, and Nino watched in horror as this happened. Due to the hit, Nino fell off, and luckily for Nino, he isn't dead but was just injured, so he slowly walked to a river. But the driver wouldn't let him go alive, so he came over to meet him, and Nino speed up his movement to the river. But the driver wouldn't let him go alive, so he came over to meet him, and Nino speed up his movement to the river. But the driver forcefully dragged him out to end his life the way he seemed fit. After, he called Bernie and informed him about his friend's death, so Bernie decided that they should end their dispute and gave him a location where they would meet. This made the driver call Irene, and he said his last goodbye, stating that might not come out alive. The next morning, he met with Bernie at the restaurant, so Bernie gave him the last deal that he can offer. He said that if the driver returns the money, Irene would be safe, but the driver would forever have to be on the lookout for his life, and he agreed. So he took Bernie to his car, and as he slowly opened the booth, the bag containing the $1 million can be seen. So he took out the bag and turned to hand it over to Bernie. Just then, Bernie stabbed him at his lower stomach, and the driver retaliated by stabbing him at a critical point at the neck. A few seconds later, he dropped down dead. The driver then entered his car with his bleeding buddy and relaxed for a while before driving out. But to prevent the rest of the gang from coming after him and Irene, he dropped the money beside Bernie's dead body. Irene, who was worried, went over to his apartment and kept knocking on the door. But she didn't get any response, and she went back to her apartment sadly. But the driver was hale and would soon arrive at his apartment. The end. What do you think about this video? Kindly comment below and stay tuned to this channel for more interesting movies updates.